All right, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory and another episode of the Quadruple D, the show within a show. So, in this episode, I'm going to examine some more ICE stories that are unfolding. I also look at the rise and legacy of George H.W. Bush and how he helped bring us to our current sorrowful state. I will also discuss Michael Dukakis and the Willie Horton smear that sunk his electoral chances. But first, the big stories of the day. State and federal officials are offering sharply different pictures of what immigration enforcement looks like in Minnesota, and those gaps are now driving public anger, protests, and arrests. At the center is a familiar conflict, a federal agency asserting sweeping authority, local officials disputing its claims, and communities absorbing the harm. So on, Thursday, today, Minnesota Department of Corrections Commissioner Paul Schnell said the state ran a point in time survey of county jails and found 301 people held with ICE detainers. So, detainers are requests from Immigration and Customs Enforcement asking local jails to notify ICE before releasing someone. They're not judicial warrants, and local governments are not legally required to honor them. So the next day, ICE Executive Assistant Director Marco Charles dismissed the state's findings, claiming the federal government has better databases and insisting that more than 1,300 people in Minnesota custody are subject to ICE detainers. So that's a bit of a discrepancy there. So this dispute matters because it highlights how unaccountable immigration enforcement has become. ICE's databases are not open to public scrutiny, and past audits by the Department of Homeland Security's own Inspector General have repeatedly found errors in ICE record keeping, including outdated or incorrect detainer information. So when federal agencies assert authority based on systems no one outside the agency can examine, so called better databases becomes a political claim, not a verifiable fact. That lack of accountability is not abstract. So on Tuesday, that's just a few days ago, federal agents detained a 5-year-old child, Liam Conejo Ramos, along with his father outside their home in the Minneapolis suburb of Columbia Heights. According to the family's attorney, the father was actively pursuing an asylum claim, a process protected under U.S. and international law. ICE officials deny that the child was targeted or used as leverage or bait, if you will, to arrest the father. Still, the result was the same. A preschooler was handcuffed by circumstance and swept into the deportation system. So, as CNN reported, I'm quoting them now, Border Patrol Commander at Large Gregory Bovino said at a Friday morning news conference that we are experts in dealing with children in the wake of controversy after a 5-year-old boy and his father were taken by ICE in Minneapolis. And remember, ICE is the same organization that just recently shot a woman in the face who was turning her wheel to drive away from ICE agents who were trying to break into her vehicle, even though she is not herself an immigrant. And of course, we know why she might have been trying to go away from them because they had their weapons drawn. So she was no doubt fearing for her life. And what do you know? She had reason to fear because they shot her and ended her life. So this kind of arrest of this child and his father reflects a broader pattern. Although ICE claims to prioritize serious criminal threats, data released in recent years shows that many people taken into ICE custody have no violent criminal convictions, and some, like asylum seekers, are actually complying with legal processes. So, for critics of the state, the issue is not whether ICE followed internal guidelines, but whether any agency should have the power to detain families at their homes with little immediate oversight, and to, of course, engage in abusive and sometimes outright murderous behavior. So, resistance to that power has spilled into public spaces. In St. Paul, three people were arrested after confronting a church's pastor who is apparently a senior ICE official. So, ironically, of course, faith communities, or religious people, if you will, have long played a role in the sanctuary movement, offering shelter or public opposition to deportations. However, MAGA has flipped Christianity on its head and defied Christ's actual teachings. Now, I'm not a Christian, but I know perfectly well that Jesus actually encourages people to treat the the immigrant as you would treat your neighbor, and that's a pretty clear and repeated pattern in the New Testament. Now, again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have definitely read those passages, and the language is very clear. Treat, an immigrant as you would your neighbor. So, ICE officials condemned the protesters' disruption in the church, while the White House praised at least one of the arrests. I'm sure they would praise them all, though. And Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry has been criticizing what ICE is doing, and the the interesting fact is that Minneapolis and St. Paul both have policies limiting cooperation with ICE, though Minnesota is not a sanctuary state. And the ability to limit cooperation is actually legal because immigration enforcement is actually at the federal level. So, it's not actually a crime to, not cooperate with ICE in the fullest extent that one could possibly imagine. It's not their jurisdiction. So the arrests have only intensified organizing across the Twin Cities. Activists are calling for a coordinated shutdown, with hundreds of Minnesota businesses expected to close and a large rally planned in Minneapolis. Organizers are urging people to protest what they describe as a nationwide escalation of immigration raids under the Trump administration, which is obviously happening, so it's not, a secret. Historically, mass protests and economic disruptions have been one of the few tools that communities have used to slow or expose deportation campaigns, from the sanctuary movements of the 1980s to more recent general strike threats. So these events are not isolated scandals, but predictable outcomes of a system built on borders, policing, and centralized authority. Whether the number is 301 people or 1,300, each detainer represents a person reduced to a data point in a federal database. And, ironically, this is right wingers doing this. These are the same people who are supposedly, paranoid about the government tracking them and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But they actually love big government so long as it's not, you know, going after them directly or people that they care about. If somebody that they care about, or if they themselves are impacted by policies, then suddenly they care. They don't have the ability to put themselves into another person's shoes as well as a person like myself has, and I'm not the most emotional person on the earth, but I can intellectually, put myself into another person's shoes. I have intellectual empathy in addition to the emotions that I have, but for whatever reason, the right wingers out there, they just can't do that. So they laugh if they hear about somebody who's, you know, a political refugee and they're traveling great distances and they're potentially going to die of thirst in a desert or something like that. They find that humorous, or they just shrug their shoulders or something like that. It's basically a sadistic ideology that just endlessly demonizes foreigners, basically, well, especially non-white foreigners. So the protests in this case, the church confrontation, and public outcry over a detained child all point to the same demand: an end to an enforcement regime that relies on fear, secrecy, and force to govern and ruin people's lives. You know, I will say it's one thing to have, you know, laws against people who are actually engaged in violence. You know, that's something I think most people would understand and agree with, you know, regardless of what your opinion is or mine. I think most people would be on board with that, but that's not all that is happening here. They're obviously targeting anybody they don't like, calling Renee Good a terrorist and stuff like that. She's not a terrorist. So, all right, moving on to the next segment, the peripheral poop head of the week, which is what I tend to call it. And this time we're looking at George H.W. Bush. So, he's on the periphery right now because obviously he's not only out of power, but he is deceased and has been for a little while now. But it's interesting to look at how his presidency and his uh, his power in general impacted the system. In fact, he actually, in some ways, encouraged Donald Trump to run for office in the first place. So, Donald Trump later claimed outsider status in U.S. politics, but as early as 1988, he was already trying to attach himself to Republican power. That year, Trump contacted Lee Atwater, who I mentioned recently in this podcast. I did a segment on him. Anyway, he was the chief strategist for George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign, and Trump was asking to be considered as Bush's vice presidential running mate. Bush reportedly dismissed that request as strange and unbelievable, and that's apparently a quote, and it really reflected how Trump was viewed at the time as a celebrity developer rather than a serious political figure. And, you know, we should never have had him as a political figure, but I suppose I would say the same thing about both Bush presidents, actually. But George Herbert Walker Bush was deeply embedded in elite U.S. political and economic institutions long before becoming president. Born on June 12, 1924, into the wealthy Bush family in Milton, Massachusetts, he grew up in privilege and moved through elite spaces almost seamlessly. He attended Phillips Academy, one of the most exclusive prep schools in the country, then Yale University, where he joined the Skull and Bones Secret Society, which is an organization long criticized as emblematic of closed ruling class networks. And of course, it even has that ominous title, Skull and Bones. It sounds actually a little bit like a satanic sort of organization right on the surface. And Bush's early public image emphasized military service. Now, for most people, that wouldn't be controversial. He flew combat missions as a Navy pilot during World War II, survived being shot down in 1944, and that story no doubt helped his presidential campaign. After the war, he leveraged family connections and capital to enter the oil business in West Texas, founding Zapata Corporation, or Zapata. Not sure how that's supposed to be pronounced. But the company benefited from Cold War geopolitics, operating offshore drilling rigs near Cuba and in the Gulf of Mexico, and has been the subject of long standing speculation about links to U.S. intelligence operations, a recurring theme in Bush's career. So, he was involved in the oil business. So I've said many times that even though we regularly hear that it's a good thing for a politician to be a businessman, I say it's not, because then you have to wonder, when they get into office, are they just trying to serve their own business interests? And sure enough, there's definite reason to believe they would be. And I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, they don't even make that connection. They don't connect the dots in a way that I think would be obvious, that if a person's getting into power, they're going to try to benefit themselves. The corruption thing is kind of an obvious pitfall, and when it's one that we're face to face with all the time in the American political system, and of course globally. Whenever you look at practically any government, there is the risk of some corruption taking shape, because, well, the government sort of is built that way. Anyway, his political rise followed a familiar pattern of elite circulation rather than grassroots support. After losing a U.S. Senate seat, or Senate race, I should say, in 1964. I don't know why I said the word seat there, but Bush won a House. Oh, that's why the word House seat is coming up in my notes. But Bush won a House seat from Texas in 1966. From there, he moved through a series of appointed positions rather than building some independent base. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under Richard Nixon, chair of the Republican National Committee during the Watergate crisis, envoy to the People's Republic of China, and, yes, director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976. So his brief CIA tenure came at a moment when the agency was facing public exposure for assassinations, coups, and domestic surveillance revealed by the Church Committee. Bush's role symbolized continuity, not reform, in the U.S. security state. So keep that in mind. So when some people are like, "Oh, George W. Bush had to have been smart to have become president," well, no, a lot of the stuff comes down to who you know. If you're if you're well connected, your parents are rich, they've served in government, they have all these sorts of business connections, and they're they're often just encouraged to you know, run for office and all that kind of stuff. It's no surprise when they win. So, George W. Bush was a moron. Obviously, he was not that smart of a guy. But some people out there, they're like, oh, he was smarter than you would think, because he was successful. Well, when you're basically handed the ladder, I mean, it doesn't take that much to climb up that ladder. So, after losing the Republican presidential primary to Ronald Reagan in 1980, Bush was selected as Reagan's vice president, a move meant to reassure party elites and foreign policy hawks. He served 2 terms as vice president from 1981 to 1989, during a period marked by U.S. backed violence in Central America, including support for death squads and authoritarian regimes in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Although Reagan was the public face of those policies, Bush was an active participant in the administration that carried them out. So, plenty of state violence right there that the Bush family was pretty heavily involved in. Bush won the presidency in 1988, defeating Democrat Michael Dukakis, who I will discuss in a little bit. And uh, of course, Bush served from 1989 to 1993. His presidency was dominated by foreign policy. He oversaw the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, which removed Manuel Noriega but killed hundreds, possibly thousands of civilians, particularly, you know, in the El Chorrillo neighborhood. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. In 1991, Bush led a U.S. controlled coalition in the Gulf War, using overwhelming force to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait while leaving Iraq devastated by bombing and later sanctions that contributed to mass civilian death and suffering, and which, of course, Bill Clinton actually went on to continue as well. So, at home, Bush governed as a pragmatic manager of the state rather than a populist. He broke his no new taxes campaign promise famously by approving tax increases to address the federal deficit, a move that angered conservatives but reflected loyalty to fiscal discipline over democratic accountability to his base. So that's something that's not often pointed out, how he uh he was basically violating his promise on the one hand, but he was also just a person who didn't care what his base wanted all the time. So you can make of that what you will, but it was definitely uh, a broken promise and a sort of window into his soul, I guess you might say, because he did not see his base as that important. He I guess you might say viewed himself as being wiser than them. So he stuck to the idea that, oh, we actually need to uh, address the federal deficit rather than um, not fund the government. So he signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Immigration Act of 1990, and the Clean Air Act amendments, all of which expanded federal regulatory power, sorry, while leaving underlying economic hierarchies intact. So it didn't really change, as much as it sounds like it did. Although I'm sure it did change some things around, but the the policy issues still would persist after you know cre- signing those into law. He also appointed Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, shaping U.S. law for decades. Of course, I've done many episodes about, well, not many, but a few episodes on Clarence Thomas before, and if you want to look into those, you should check those out. Bush lost the '92 election to Bill Clinton, largely because Bill Clinton, admittedly, he looked cool when he was playing the saxophone on, I believe, the Arsenio Hall show, and that was actually a bigger part of his win than some people would probably like to admit. But it's also true that there was an economic recession and declining public interest in Cold War era foreign policy. So those were also factors. And his career really shows how U.S. power circulates within a narrow elite, combining wealth, military force, so called intelligence agencies, and electoral politics to preserve state authority rather than challenge some of its worst features. All right, so the third segment of the day, of this episode, I should say, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And like I suggested, this is about Michael Dukakis and the Willie Horton scandal. So, in the 1988 presidential election, Bush defeated Democrat Michael Dukakis. So, why did that happen? Why did Michael Dukakis have a hard time? Well, Dukakis didn't have a classic personal corruption scandal, no Watergate, no bribery case, no sexual misconduct cover up. What he's most associated with instead is the Willie Horton furlough controversy, which became the defining scandal of his career, even though it wasn't illegal or secret. So here's what happened, and I'll try to make this relatively brief. As governor of Massachusetts, Dukakis supported a prison furlough program that allowed inmates serving life sentences to take short, supervised releases. The program existed before him and was used in many states. Ronald Reagan himself had run a furlough program in California, but Republican partisan hacks behaved as if Dukakis was somehow unique, and he wasn't really that unique. In 1987, however, Willie Horton, a convicted murderer on furlough, failed to return and later committed assault and sexual violence in Maryland. During the 1988 presidential campaign, Republicans turned this into a national issue, portraying Dukakis as dangerously soft on crime. And of course, Republicans do that routinely, regardless of even what the Democrats' record looks like. They make it seem like they don't believe in, putting anybody in prison ever, when of course that's not true, but they like to lie about it. And for better or for worse, in my opinion, for worse, that that propaganda campaign worked politically. The Bush campaign ran infamous ads linking Dukakis personally to Horton's crimes, and Dukakis never recovered. So it, it's called a scandal, even though it wasn't one really. The program was legal, bipartisan, and widely supported by corrections professionals themselves. Horton's crime was a rare but extreme failure, not evidence of total systemic collapse. Basically, it's like it's hard to speak in favor of what Willie Horton did, but it wasn't a very common thing. Actually, the programs actually did contribute to reducing crime. And Dukakis didn't create the policy himself, and he didn't violate any rules. So the scandal was mostly manufactured outrage, amplified by racial fear and media repetition. What you can say is that he didn't bar people who were imprisoned for first degree murder from the furloughs. So, in that sense, and only in that sense, was this scandalous. And from a more reasonable perspective, I think this episode looks very different from how it's usually framed. So, point number one is that the state's violence gets, displaced onto individuals in our culture. Our society, our government, and social policy, or you might say antisocial policy, actually encourages a society with more crime. And if you don't believe that, well, you can definitely find examples of societies with fewer crimes than the United States. And in fact, the right wing propagandists out there will always try to make America actually look more violent than it actually is. Now, obviously, I'm not saying crime does not exist. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm not even saying, like, oh, prison should be outright abolished or anything like that. But it's always a little bit more complex than just saying, oh, it comes down to the individuals in every case, because again, not all societies have the same rate of violent crime as the United States. So there's something unique going on here that ends up creating more violent crime. So keep in mind that in many ways, the prison system itself is violent and coercive. So the Horton case kind of flips that logic. Instead of asking whether mass incarceration is perfectly legitimate or humane, the state used one crime to justify expanding punishment and control. So the bigger scandal isn't that Horton was released, it's that the state cages people for life while it engages in violent activity and other antisocial policies that would be criminal if an ordinary person did them. It's a fact that the United States government is constantly engaged in war. You know, we we recently stole an oil tanker from Venezuela, for example. That's just outright piracy. The idea that the U.S. government is the arbiter of morality here is just absurd when we've got things like that. And of course, even if you look at the history of the Gulf War and stuff like that, well, as much as we demonized Saddam Hussein, the US government had actually supported Saddam Hussein during many of his worst atrocities, like the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. And of course, the media doesn't talk about this, but the support for Saddam Hussein actually went all the way back to the John F. Kennedy administration. I mean, that should be something that people hear about more often, but it's not. And I guess that's by intent of design. So, of course, the media and the government, especially under right wingers, uses fear to demand even harsher confinement and more demonization of criminals. And of course, you're going to end up getting the viewpoint in a lot of cases that, oh, criminals are everywhere. They're literally all over the place. And while ignoring these social conditions that produce harm in the first place, which of course are real things. So again, I'm not saying that the prison system needs to be totally abolished or whatever. And it wouldn't be up to me anyway, single handedly to decide what happens as far as crime goes. But the point is, if you focus solely on the individual criminal acts, you're going to miss the larger picture. So the outrage here wasn't actually about the victims because the US government does not actually care about victims of violence because it creates victims of violence through its policies. The outrage was about protecting the authority of the prison system and the military system. So, the Dukakis thing represents a classic reformist trap. He supported a modest technocratic reform inside a violent system, and when something went wrong, the system turned on him. So look at it this way: you can't adequately humanize a fundamentally coercive institution through policy tweaks. The state will always sacrifice reformers to preserve its legitimacy and declare its own violence as the supremely acceptable form of violence. And it will, of course, exaggerate the level of violence of people outside of the confines of the government. The super rich, like the billionaire class. Like right now, as I speak, they're not releasing the Epstein files, which involves, of course, sexual violence. I mean, a lot of people. I mean, I shouldn't have to spell it out like this. This is a little bit awkward, but the crime there isn't just that some people were underage. It's that they were being, forced to commit sex acts. And I assume some people haven't heard this, but there was apparently some torture being applied as well. And of course, they were absconded to an island in the middle of nowhere. And actually, Jeffrey Epstein apparently bought a nearby island to help prevent any scrutiny by anybody else on that nearby island so he can get away with his crimes. And of course, you had all of these billionaire types and people with a lot of power who were involved in Epstein's crimes. And they're trying to not release those files because it would expose people, most certainly from both parties and from the, let's just say, the billionaire class. So they're supposed to be able to get away with crimes. It's everybody else, who doesn't make a shit ton of money. They're supposed to be the ones who are demonized. Well, interestingly, the population is, flipping that around, uh, and turning it into a campaign against the billionaire class because they have been more fully exposed, which is really interesting. And fortunately, you have a little bit of a bipartisan effort here. In fact, you even have Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, who, much to my surprise, were all about, exposing the Epstein stuff. And in fact, I never thought I would be saying kind things about Marjorie Taylor Greene, but she has at least semi redeemed herself in, these recent events. Anyway, that's about it for the other segment, the final segment of the show. You know, well, I should note that the Willie Horton scandal, of course, used racialized fear as a form of social control. The Horton ads were explicitly racialized. You had a black man, a mugshot image, ominous narration, and people have long argued that race is a tool that the state uses to justify policing and incarceration and making the police unaccountable and assuring they can get away with any violent acts that they want to get away with. So, from that angle, this episode, this Willie Horton thing is a textbook example of the media manufacture and consent for repression, using racial panic to discipline voters, reinforcing the idea that safety only comes from cages and cops, and of course, from warfare and stuff like that. So the scandal functioned as propaganda. And, you know, uh, it's a. It's a bit of a sad thing in some ways what happened to Dukakis because he was blamed for a crime that he did not commit through a system he did not particularly control. That he didn't exclusively single-handedly control the furlough program or the prison or the police or anything like that. And there were social conditions he did not uniquely create. And of course, he didn't commit the crime himself. I mean, it's rather funny how this happens. Like, somebody else commits a crime, and then you claim that a politician is, uniquely responsible for it. You might say the political system that they create is in some way responsible, but it's not like Dukakis was the one who went out and did the crime himself. Meanwhile, prosecutors, police, legislators, and prison administrators all escape scrutiny on a large scale. Structural violence stayed invisible to a large degree, and punitive policy expanded, as I've noted earlier with the George H.W. Bush policies, international violence and domestic violence. So the asymmetry is exactly what people criticize about the lack of state accountability. So, it was a political morality play used to reinforce mass incarceration, racial fear, and the idea that the state's violence is the only answer to harm. So the lesson isn't be tougher on crime, it's that the state will always choose punishment over justice and it will potentially destroy anyone who briefly forgets that rule. So that is the message here, more than, uh, crime is good or bad. Of course, most people think that, violent crime is bad. Most people would think that, if you commit a violent crime, you should be uh, possibly put away for life. I mean, that's tough, though. I mean, because are there no circumstances individually where you thought about um, committing a violent crime? Yeah, the ideas never popped up in your head during a moment of rage or anything like that. So I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to say it's a good thing to be violent, but I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily make a person a supervillain. And there's that long-standing debate about should you always lock somebody up and throw away the key. Well, we already know that politicians can get away with violence directly by, plotting invasions and stuff like that. Well, if they can get away with it and we view society as doing just fine, then maybe in some cases, you know, people should be given a second chance. I'm sure I will be demonized uh, for making that argument, but it kind of is, I mean, oddly enough, a liberal idea. It's what a lot of people have believed in the past, although we're expected to never believe somebody could ever, redeem themselves. And sure enough, there are some examples where you have repeat offenders, but, everything's a gamble. I mean, that's the thing. And a lot of consequences happen when you have mass incarceration and you have a system that, you know, just keeps these social advantages up among the rich and well connected and keeps on punishing those down below. If you deprive people of opportunities and life just looks rotten, and you don't know your neighbors, you don't like your neighbors, you don't trust other people, and it just seems like life is a game of domination. Well, that's going to contribute to antisocial attitudes and this idea that you're competing against everybody and that it's all about you. You got to put yourself first and foremost, and that's going to make crime more likely.